Hello and a very good day. Thank you so much for joining in on this webinar. My name is Abhilash, and I am from the AD Solutions or the Active Directory Solutions team here at Manage Engine, and I will be your presenter for today. Now, before we go ahead and jump in, I would like to thank all of you for taking out the time. Thank you so much for taking out the time amongst your busy schedule and for being a part of this webinar. Now, before we go ahead and jump in, since we're all working from home, I'm sure most of you are working from home as well. I just wanted to run a quick audio and a video check because I wanted to make sure that everybody out here today are able to hear me well and are able to see the screen well. So if my voice is well and audible without any distortion or without any breakage in the audio, can you give me a confirmation using the chat window or the Q&A tab, please? Just say yes, just say okay, just say great, so I can confirm that my voice is reaching to you well and clear. Thank you so much for your responses. I hope the video is proper as well. I hope you can see the title and the email ID as well. At any point in time, if you feel that the audio is breaking away or there's a lag between the audio and the video, please do let me know and I'll do my best to get that fixed from my end. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you that this entire session, the entire 45 to 50-minute session is going to be recorded and the recordings will be sent to your respective email addresses after the webinar. So if you've got any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A tab. Keep your questions coming and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And even if I miss answering your questions, please do not worry. The last 10 to 15 minutes of today's session will be a dedicated Q&A session. So I will be answering your questions then as well. And of course, later during the day, if you have any questions, if there's any doubt about the solution or the webinar in your mind that you'd like to ask me, just let me know and I'll be more than happy to write back to you on your email, right? So yes, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. The topic for today is dangerous defaults that put your IT environment at risk, right? So why did I choose to speak about this topic today? And what are dangerous defaults, right? Now, the whole reason I chose to speak about defaults or the default configurations of any IT environment for that matter is because whenever we talk about cybersecurity or whenever we speak about securing our IT network or our IT infrastructure, we often talk about vulnerabilities and misconfigurations on the network that attackers leverage to gain access to your data or to the servers or to the users inside your network, right? So misconfigurations are generally user made, they are generally process triggered. But one thing that we tend to not see or we tend to ignore is the default configurations of your IT environment, right? The default settings, the out of the box settings, the policies in your network that haven't been enabled yet, how these settings, when left default, can also act as a misconfiguration, and how attackers leverage these default configurations, these unchanged or unmodified configurations to gain access to your network, right? So what are defaults after all? Dangerous defaults can be known as anything that hasn't been changed, hasn't been updated, or hasn't been modified in a long, long time in your network, right? Now, whenever we set up a device, a smartphone, a software, or even a Windows system for that matter, we are provided with default settings, right? There are always generally two options, default settings or custom settings. So the whole point of default settings is to give you a jump start into the product, right? So manufacturers and vendors, they generally provide default settings because they want you to experience the product firsthand without having to undergo all the trouble with the initial configuration, right? So default settings are good because they let you experience the product firsthand. You don't have to wait before you jump in and use the product. But these default settings must be changed, right? Because like I said, these settings are meant to put usability first, and they are not secure, not by a long shot. right? So what are dangerous defaults in an IT network? Now, before we get started, I'd just like to say that dangerous defaults vary from one IT network to another. It depends on which directory service you use. It depends on which applications you use. It depends on how your IT environment looks like. But if we have to classify dangerous defaults, we can classify it in three types, right? So the first kind of dangerous defaults in IT environments is typically whenever you install a server or whenever you install an application or a service, there are certain configurations that haven't been changed in a long time, right? So the first example of a dangerous default is unchanged configuration whenever a new device, a new endpoint, or a new application or a service is added to your network. The second kind of dangerous default is anything that is pertaining to your directory services. Now, you may use on-premises Active Directory, or you may use cloud services like Azure Active Directory. And these services are typically used to manage the permissions your users have on a network, manage the permissions on the servers or on the data. And these services like Active Directory, they come in with certain default settings that must be changed. If not, they in itself are a security risk, right? And the last classification of a dangerous default can be areas of your network that haven't been monitored for changes in a long, long time, right? For example, your core system files and folders, like your program files 86 folder, right? So if we have to classify dangerous defaults, it can be defaults on any endpoint on your network. It can be defaults on any application, a service, a user. It can be defaults in a directory service that you typically use to manage your entire network or administer your entire network. It can be various areas in your network that haven't been changed or haven't been updated in a long, long time, right? So before we jump in, here's a small example as to how dangerous defaults can lead to a full scale security breach on your network, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to minimize the screen and I will open up my virtual machine right here. And you can see that this is my virtual machine and I am actually logged in as the administrator, right? But the one thing I would like you to know is that this attack that we're going to perform right now can be performed by any user, including your non-privileged user, right? So in this case, I only have access to the administrator's account. So let's work with that. So let me quickly show you how this works, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to type in a command that basically gives me, I'm pretty sure you would have guessed it already, a list of group members in Active Directory, right? So let's say I want to get the members of the administrators group, right? And once I enter within a few seconds, I will have all the members of the administrators group, their display names, their full names, their distinguished names, and more details, right? Now, let's just give this a few seconds. Right? So what's going to happen is when this command executes, I apologize, my system is a little slow here, but when this command executes, we will have a list of all administrative users, right? And it simply doesn't end here. Here you go. We've gotten all the administrative users in the domain, right? And it simply doesn't end here, not just the admin users. You can basically extract any kind of information about your Active Directory infrastructure by just running a few commands, right? So let me show you another command right here. Get AD default domain password policy, right? So a command like this will instantly give you the password policy of the domain, right? It just doesn't end here. There are many tools on the internet. For example, go dump domain info. Here's a tool right here. This is a PowerShell based tool. This is a command line shell based tool that will help you extract critical information from your infrastructure. It could be Active Directory, it could be Azure, right? Now, the reason I'm showing you all this is because typically in IT environments, an end user with no privileges can simply log in, open up a command line shell, and extract information about your infrastructure. It could be information about Active Directory or cloud services like Azure or AWS, or the location of servers in your network, like any NetApp servers or database servers, etc. And this is the first step that attackers generally employ to plan their moves in the domain or to plan their attack in a domain, right? Now, the reason I showed you this is because this is a classic example of an unchecked default in your network, right? We typically don't check for our users who are executing commands on PowerShell, right? And users can execute commands on PowerShell to gain target-rich information about your network. This is a default setting. This is how environments like Active Directory or Azure are designed, are architected. This is something we don't look into. This is a default setting, and this is how a default setting could lead to a full-scale security incident, right? So this is just an example I just wanted to show you as to how a simple command on a shell like PowerShell can lead to a full-scale security incident, right? Because before performing any attack, the first step that attackers generally do is they try and extract information about the IT network, the location of administrative users, the location of privileged servers in your network, which will help them plan their moves in a domain, right? So how do you detect this? AD360 can help because AD360 has a module called AD Audit Plus, inside of which you've got a component called PowerShell auditing, right? Now, this is really important because PowerShell auditing will let you audit the commands that your end users are running, and not just the commands. It will also let you audit the scripts that your end users are executing, right? So you get to know which user is executing the script. You get to know the source system from where the script is being executed. You get to read into the script data. Basically, you get to know what script is being executed. You get to read into the function blocks of the script, right? And not just script, you also get to know the individual commands or any command that your end users are invoking in PowerShell, right? So here you go. Here are the commands invoked. These reports are completely searchable, and you can set up alerts as well, right? So if you head into configuration, create new alert profile, you can set up an alert where the authorized user is alerted via email and via SMS, right? So this is an example of a dangerous default, and this is how you can monitor it. Unfortunately, the only way to monitor command line activities is by monitoring what's happening on the command line, right? So what do we have next? Here are a few more examples of unchecked defaults and how they could lead to a security incident, right? I have a question here from one of our attendees saying that I'm assuming that the user has remote server administration tools installed. So get AD group member, yes, it is a command that needs remote server administration tools, but this is just an example, right? Commands can be in any form. You needn't actually need remote server administrative tools. For example, the tool that I just showed you called go dump domain info, this does not need RSAT tools. This does not need remote server administration tools. All you got to do is just install it, and it will get you information from Active Directory by using PowerShell, right? So get AD group member. Yes, that's an example when you have RSAT installed. But if you don't have RSAT installed, there are other commands that you can eventually run to extract information from Active Directory, right? So yes, let's take a look at other examples of dangerous defaults and how they could lead to a full-scale security incident. So the first example I wanted to talk about here was your standard local users and local administrators. Now, typically, I'm sure most of you know this already, when you set up a server or a Windows endpoint in a network, there are two kinds of accounts, right? You've got the local administrator account and you've got the standard, the local user account, right? Now, the local administrator account, you could think of the local administrator account as the superintendent of an apartment complex. Typically, in an apartment complex, the superintendent has access to every room in the apartment complex. And in the case of an IT network, a local admin has keys to every server in a network, right? So the reason I chose to speak about the local administrator accounts is because typically whenever we set up our Windows servers in our environment, we use the local administrator account, and then we typically do not change the passwords of the local administrator account, right? So what I'm getting at here is that unchanged passwords for a local user account, like a local administrator account, can also lead to a security incident, right? So let me show you a simple example right here. Now, I told you that it's pretty easy for an end user to just run a few commands and extract information about Active Directory, like what the password policy is or what the admin users are. And yes, this can be done without remote server administration tools. It's just a bunch of commands that you can run. And by default, every user in Active Directory environments has read privileges on every other object, right? So this is possible even without RSAT tools. And once you get the required information, let me show you a quick example right here. So if I minimize this, open up my browser, and here's an attack that I just wanted to show you, right? So what you see on your screen right now is a simple PowerShell script, right? That again, any user can execute, right? So I have the administrative user right here. This is the name of the administrator of the organization. This is the name of the domain controller. And I have a file name that has, let's say, 100 passwords, right? This is an example of a classic brute force attack. And here's what's going to happen, right? I'm going to run all of these passwords against the administrator account, right? Once I execute the script, you can see that within a few seconds, I've got the passwords and I have access to the local administrator account, right? So it's typical that in networks where the local admin accounts passwords are not changed, they have passwords, predictable passwords like password at 123 or admin at 123, and a simple brute force attack from an endpoint can help compromise the local administrator account and gain access to the plain text password, right? So we've tried 43 passwords right here, right? Now I want you to pay attention to something here. If I minimize this, open up my VM, this is my group policy, right? And this is my default domain policy. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click on the default domain policy, hit edit, and head into something called the account lockout policy. I'm pretty sure you would have seen this or even worked with it in your environment, right? The account lockout policy, like you may already know, is used to set a lockout threshold to an account, meaning how many times a user can type in an invalid password before his or her account gets locked out, right? So if I head into security settings, and jump into account lockout policies. Here we have the lockout threshold of the domain, and the lockout threshold is 10. So typically, after 10 invalid password attempts, the user's account will actually get locked out, right? But in this case, the administrator's account, we were able to try 43 passwords. Now, how did that actually happen? How could we try 43 passwords on an account without actually triggering an account lockout? The reason for that is because the local administrator account has no lockout threshold. So this policy right here, it does not apply to your local admin account, right? So you could brute force a million passwords on the local admin account and it will never get locked out, which makes it a prime target in brute force attacks, right? And the fact that local admin accounts are typically reused across multiple servers in a network gives an attacker more and more access. That's why I would encourage you to monitor password-based attacks on the local admin account. And because most attacks these days are script-based, I would encourage you to monitor the scripts that your end users are running. So if I head into server audit right here, like I showed you, we've got PowerShell auditing, and this will help you monitor any scripts your end users are running. This will help you read into the function blocks or code blocks. This will help you monitor the commands your end users are running as well, right? Now, another important solution that you need to deploy for your local admin accounts is called Microsoft Labs. I am pretty sure you would have heard of this. So Microsoft Labs, also known as the local administrator password solution, will let you securely rotate the passwords for your local admin accounts at a predefined interval, at a healthy interval, so you can ensure strong passwords for your local admin accounts. But one thing about the local administrator password solution is that these passwords, right? This will help you strengthen your admin passwords, but these passwords are stored in plain text, right? So this is the attribute that stores the local admin passwords when Microsoft Labs is deployed in your network, right? So I would encourage you to monitor activities on Labs as well. So if I head into the AD Audit Plus module, head into reports, scroll further down, you've got something called Labs Audit. And over here, you get to know if the Labs attribute is being queried by any user to read the plain text password, right? So monitor attacks on your accounts by monitoring activities on PowerShell. Deploy labs to ensure that your local administrator accounts passwords are changed regularly, and monitor the labs attribute because, like I said, the attribute stores passwords in plain text. Right? So this is just an example of how local admin accounts or local user accounts can be subject to an attack. Here is another such example where an attacker with access to a guest machine in a network or with access to an endpoint machine can hard reboot the system, force it into Windows automatic repair mode, and leverage that built-in Windows feature, the automatic repair mode, to basically hard reset the passwords of the local admin account, right? Now, automatic repair was generally created by Microsoft to help users with boot related issues. But now attackers have found a way where they could hard reboot a system, launch automatic repair, and hard reset the password of your local admin users, right? Or any local user on your domain for that matter. And we can help you audit such activities because we audit activities across your endpoints as well, where you get to know when a computer is starting up and shutting down. So if you find that your computers in your network are randomly starting up or shutting down, it could be a ransomware attack, or it could be a user who's trying to force reset the password of the local admin in your network, right? So this is just another way access to a local admin user can be obtained. This may not be that widely used, but just another way as to how local admin accounts can be broken into, right? The second example we have here is dangerous defaults on domain users, right? So like your local users, you've got certain dangerous defaults on your domain users as well. There are many ways default settings can be set on domain users. The most classic way is during user on and off boarding, right? Now, often as admins, we get calls, we are forced to mass onboard users or create users in bulk. And once we create users in bulk, these accounts are generally not all used, right? There are a few accounts lying around in your network that haven't been used yet. And these accounts are often targeted by attackers because they generally have weak passwords set because admins create these accounts and believe that a user who is going to use this account is going to reset the password before he or she logs on. But little does the admin know that these accounts are still lying unused in the network, right? Sometimes users, when they leave the organization, they are not properly disabled. They still have active Office 365 licenses. They still have mailboxes. They are still enabled in Active Directory. Users who are on vacation or suspension, they are not really cleaned up, right? So these are all examples of accounts that are enabled, but they haven't been used in a long time. In short, these are also known as inactive user accounts or ghost user accounts, right? So attackers can find many ways to compromise these inactive user accounts. Here is one such example. An attacker can simply run a command on any of your command line shells, right? PowerShell, command prompt, and get details about users who haven't been used or who haven't been active in a long, long time, right? And once an attacker finds an account that is enabled but hasn't been used in a long time, let me show you a quick example right here. If I minimize my browser, head into my PowerShell session right here, here's what I'm going to do, right? I will import a simple script called domain password spray.ps1, right? So the script is imported and I have the script right here on my desktop. Let me quickly show that to you. right? So this is a bit slow. All right, so here you go. Here's the script right on my desktop, and here's what I'm going to do, right? I will run a command called invoke domain password spray, and I will give in a password, right? Let's just say password at 123, because typically inactive accounts are accounts that have not been used in a long time or have not been used at all. So there's a good possibility that these accounts have passwords like this. And once I hit enter, what's going to happen now is that this password will be sprayed on all password policies on your domain. Even if you have fine grained password policies on your domain, it will be attacked by this particular password. And let's just give this a few seconds. All right. And once we hit confirm, right, once I give yes, you can see that the spray attack has started. And within a few seconds, I will have a list of users and their passwords if our password spray attack has worked, right? So this is just an example as to how domain user accounts, well, they are not used all the time. They are often left enabled but not used, and how attackers can launch a full-blown password spray attack on them, right? So we can help you with this. So if I open up the browser, head into AD Manager Plus, this is yet another component of AD 360, head into reports. Let me quickly log back in. Head into reports, and you've got something called inactive users right here, right? So you could select the time, and this will give you all users who are enabled but haven't been used in a long time on your domain. So now you could select the user, you could delete the user, you could disable him or her, or you could move the user to another container. And if you have multiple domain controllers, you can check for inactive users across the domain controllers. You can go back in time. You can check for inactive users on an OU level as well if you want to, right? If I head back into reports, there's a lot more you can do to identify dangerous defaults on your user objects on your domain. For example, you see this users never logged on. This will let you know your user accounts who have been created, but they have never been used in your domain. This is just another example of how often accounts can be leveraged by attackers. Heading back, there's something called password reports. And do you see this? These are accounts who haven't changed their passwords in a long time, typically service accounts. And checking this will let you understand which users have not changed their passwords, and you can enforce a password change the next time the user logs on just by using the built-in management features into these reports, right? So my point here is there are many ways users can be misconfigured. There are many ways certain default settings on user accounts can be leveraged in attacks, right? Here is one more such example, and that is your user duplications. Right now, whenever there is a time crunch, whenever you have to onboard multiple users on your domain, this is what you typically do, right? You open up your browser, you head into the Active Directory users and computers tool, and let's say I have a user account right here. So what I do is I copy the user account, and then once I hit copy, I create a new user account who will have the same properties as Jen in this case, right? So this is good. This will help you create user accounts faster, but more often than not, I personally noticed on IT networks that user accounts have properties that they're not really supposed to have. And here's such an example. This is something I saw live in one of the environments we were supposed to audit. And this is what happened, right? So what happened was a user was a member of the Exchange Windows permissions group, right? And many other user accounts had been duplicated of this particular user, had been copied of this particular user. So all of those other accounts had Exchange Windows permissions as a group, right? So they were all members of this group. The problem with this is this particular group that you see has write access on the domain node. So do you see this? This is the domain DNS node, and that particular group, it had write access on the domain node, right? So if I head into properties, do you see this security tab? So any user with permissions on the domain node will automatically have permissions on every other object on the domain, right? So this is what happened here. Just because user objects were duplicated of other users, the every user had this group membership, and automatically all of them had privileges that they were not really supposed to have, namely write privileges on the entire domain, right? So this is where we can help. If I head into the browser AD Manager Plus, do you see this called the Management tab? And do you see this called Templates? Now you can use templates to basically predefine user attribute values, right? So let me quickly open up the marketing users template right here. So over here, you can predefine the user attribute values, values like group memberships, values like the password of the user, any password flags or account properties flags that must be set, the computers the user can log on to, the logon hours of the user, and a lot more. So when you predefine the attributes and create a template, the next time you have to onboard a set of users, all you have to do is just head into create bulk users. And once you head into create bulk users, you can just choose the template from the drop down and you are good to go, right? All you have to do is given the name of the users and they will be created in a secure way by using the template that you had predefined with the legit properties. So there won't be any more mistakes of you copying users of other users and properties remaining unchanged, and templates can help with that, right? Another important thing I want to talk about was if I head into automation right here, you can basically automate the entire process of onboarding, right? Using AD Manager Plus, you can create users not just in Active Directory, but across Office 365, Exchange servers, and Google Suite if you do have it. And not just automation, you can basically also automate other activities, like, for example, your orphan or ghost account cleanup. Now, all you got to do is type in a command right here that says ghost account cleanup, right? You can select an automation task, let's say disable users. You can select a report right here. From the reports, you can select your inactive user reports. Here you go. Let's say I want to disable all my inactive users from the last 90 days. You can hit OK. And once you do that, you can set the time for the automation, and the automation will be run automatically, disabling all inactive users. Now you can set the time to be hourly or on a monthly basis, and each time an automation runs, and the admin will be automatically notified, right? Heading into automation policy, there's something more you can do here where you can not only disable users in Active Directory, but you can also clean up users across other environments as well, right? For example, you can delete user mailboxes from Exchange if you do have Exchange. You can also, let's say, remove their Office 365 licenses or remove them from all Microsoft 365 groups, right? So this is just another way dangerous defaults on your domain users can lead to a security incident. So basically, clean up your inactive user accounts by leveraging AD Manager Plus. You can automate that entire process and be careful when you duplicate users of other accounts, right? Even better, just use predefined templates so you can ensure that users, when they are onboarded safely and securely without any unnecessary properties or attribute values on them, right? The third use case I want to talk about here was dangerous default policies on your network that can potentially compromise the security of your network, right? So just like local users, just like domain users, there are certain policies on your network that can lead to a security incident. Now let me show you a classic example of that right here. If I minimize this, open up my virtual machine, right? This is my group policies. Right? If I head back into it, open up the password policy, you see these settings, these 6 settings. So these 6 settings are used to determine the strength of passwords in your network, right? Now, these 6 settings, they were introduced in the year 2000, basically when Active Directory started. They have been around for the last 20 years or even more than 20 years, and they haven't undergone a single update, right? The rules in your network that are responsible for creating and maintaining passwords are the most dangerous default on your network because they use policies that haven't been changed in ages, right? So I can go on and on, but the point here is these 6 policies, they must be updated according to the current password security requirements, and they haven't undergone an update, and attackers have found a way around these passwords, right? This policy that you see right here is the most dangerous policy or most dangerous default on the group policies on your network. right? Or on the security policies of your network, right? So we can help you sort this issue. But before we get into that, let's talk about the cloud, right? So what happens is because your password policy is weak, your on-premise users have weak passwords, and when you deploy cloud services like Azure, you typically use services like password hash synchronization, right? This is the most widely used service in environments. And when you do so, what happens is you send the passwords from your on-premises infrastructures to your Azure infrastructures, right? So because your on-premises user passwords are weak, you send the weak passwords to Azure as well, thereby increasing the attack surface or increasing the surface for compromise on your network, right? So this is where we can help because we can help you enforce a password policy that is in accordance with today's password security requirements. So if I minimize my browser, head into AD Self-Service Plus, another module of AD 360, head into the configuration tab right here, right? Let me quickly log back in. And I will quickly head into the configuration tab. And inside the configuration tab, you see this called the password policy enforcer. These are password policy rules that you need to upgrade to as soon as possible because your Active Directory's password policy is extremely weak, right? So this has rules that are in accordance with today's security requirements. For example, you can ban the use of certain patterns like password at 123, right? This is something you can't do in Active Directory. You can ban the use of dictionary words as passwords. You can restrict repetition of characters from an older username or an older password. You can set the number of uppercase, lowercase, special characters. You can set the minimum and the maximum length of characters. Now, my point here is these rules, they will help you enforce password security like never before, right? When you do this, when your AD's passwords are automatically strengthened because your users have to adhere to this password policy. Whenever they change it, or whenever an admin resets the password, or whenever a new user is created with a password, this password policy will kick in, ensuring password security, right? Now, we have to address the cloud as well, right? Because in organizations, many of you use cloud applications, and we need to talk about their logons as well. Just talking about Active Directory logons in 2021 is not sufficient. And to address that problem, we support single sign-on for many cloud applications. Applications like Office 365, applications like Google Suite, applications like HackerRank, and a lot more, right? So what am I trying to say here is that once you set up single sign-on, we support 107 applications. If you have any other application, you can set that up using the custom application option right here. So what I'm trying to say here is when you set up single sign-on, your user only has to authenticate himself or herself at the Active Directory logon, at the domain systems logon, right? And once the user authenticates himself or herself at the domain logon, that's all he or she needs to do because when single sign-on is deployed, the user will have seamless access to all cloud applications without having to enter a password another time, right? So let me show this to you in action right here. So as you can see, I'm logging in as my user Brad. And once I log into the system, what I'm going to do here is I will open up my browser and launch AD Self-Service Plus, right? And note this, Brad does not have to enter a password to log into AD Self-Service Plus. It happens automatically because we've deployed single sign-on and authentication is already done at the domain join system. So Brad logs on and Brad accesses the applications tab within AD Self-Service Plus, right? So once Brad accesses the applications tab, selects an application like Office 365, he or she will be automatically logged on to Office 365 and yet again without having to enter a password, right? This is just single sign-on at its best. So if your user decides to log into their endpoint, all they have to do is authenticate using the password policy that you've deployed in AD Self-Service Plus, and they can use the AD Self-Service Plus console to access the application, or even if they decide to simply access the application via the URL, right? If they decide to simply open up a new URL, access the application, they can do that as well. And even then, single sign-on will kick in, enforcing a strong password policy at all logons, right? So what do I mean by this? Let me show you a quick illustration that will make this easier, right? Your user, all he or she has to do is enter a password at their domain join system. And this password is governed by the password policy. With single sign-on deployed, your user does not have to enter a password another time. He or she will be able to access all cloud applications easily, right? Now, this is password security, and without covering two-factor authentication, our passwords are never really secure, right? So we support that as well. If I open up my browser, head into the configuration tab, you see multi-factor authentication right here. And do you see multi-factor authentication for endpoints? So we support multi-factor authentication for your endpoints. When it comes to Windows, Mac OS, Linux, we support that. You can select a multi-factor authentication process for your endpoints. So this is how it would essentially work, right? So when a user logs on to his or her domain joint system, he or she enters a password that is governed by the AD self-service plus his password policy, right? Once that is done, he or she will have to undergo a multi-factor authentication process at the logon. In this case, it happens to be a smartphone multi-factor authentication. And when the user approves the smartphone authentication, he or she will be allowed to log on to the domain, right? So what am I trying to say here? All your user has to do is enter the password once, undergo the multi-factor authentication process once, and once he or she does that, he or she will have seamless access to all applications, right? Now, these applications could be on premises, these resources could be on premises or in the cloud. Because you've deployed single sign-on, your user will not have to enter a password another time, right? So this is an example of how a password policy is a default password policy is too old, has outdated settings, and the need to upgrade it before your passwords are compromised or before your password security of your network is compromised, right? Speaking of policies, there are a lot more policies you look into. Here is one more such example, right? So we have our group policies on our domain. And the problem with group policies is that in most cases, settings remain in the non-defined state, right? Or settings that have to be enabled are disabled, and settings that have to be disabled are enabled, right? So this is really not a safe approach when it comes to policies, because leaving them in the default, not defined, or the unconfigured state is also a security risk, right? Here's one such example. Your users, by default, can simply open up Task Manager on your domain, right? Head into details, open up a process called the LSA. Now, this is the local security authority. The users can right click on it, create a dump file, right? Now, what happens when you create a dump file? You get a memory dump file, which you can then take back home, open up a tool like Mimikatz, and extract credentials from that dump file, right? And this is because all your users who've ever logged onto that system remotely or interactively, their credentials are stored in the local memory, right? Giving attackers an opportunity to extract credentials from the local memory. And this group policy setting, when enabled, disables that feature. So even if your users, they try and create a dump file of the local process, they will not find any credentials in it because you've basically disabled the storing of credentials in the local memory. That's why I say do not leave policies as is, do not leave them in the not defined state, do update them, right? There are a lot more policies you can look into. For example, this is yet another important aspect of security, user rights assignment, right? Over here, you can give your users certain privileges to log on remotely to a system. You can give your users privileges to take ownership of files or folders. You can give your users privileges to basically clear up the security log of your domain, thereby hiding any attack attempts on your domain. And there's a lot more that these privileges can do, right? You can also give the user privileges to back up certain files or folders, overriding administrative privileges. And there's a lot more that's happening. So I would encourage you to not leave these policies in the not defined state, but set them up, give your authorized users permissions so you can ensure security on your domain, right? These are just examples of unconfigured policies and how they could lead to a security incident. Just another example of that is your audit policies. Now you need to enable audit policies on your domain to audit certain events that are happening on your domain, right? When you do not enable your audit policies or when you leave them in the not defined state, any activity that's happening on your domain will not be captured in the event viewer, giving you no chance to track anything malicious or suspicious or sensitive that's happening on your domain, right? So that's my point here. Do not leave policies in the unconfigured state, update them, give authorized users permissions, and do not leave them in the not defined state, right? Policies in your cloud also are not as secure as you think. For example, if I open up my Azure console right here, head into your user settings, right? Do you see this option right here called administration portal, restrict access to the admin portal? Users, just like in Active Directory, also have read access to all resources in Azure. So they can simply log into Azure and extract target rich information from Azure. This is not good. So restrict access to the Azure administration portal and allow only authorized users to access the admin portal, right? This is set to no by default, but do enable it to yes. And there are a few ways where your end users can register third-party applications and give consent to that application to access data on behalf of the user or even on behalf of the entire organization, right? This setting is set to yes by default, but I would encourage you to give only authorized users to the ability to register applications in Azure environments as well, right? Because if any user is allowed to register an application, then any user will be able to grant an application access to Azure data on behalf of that victim user or even on behalf of the entire organization. Because attackers are leveraging default mistakes such as this in not just Active Directory, but also your Azure environments, right? Attackers typically trick a user to give consent to a malicious application. And once the user gives consent, the malicious application will be able to access data on behalf of that user. Only because this default setting, users can register applications, is enabled on your domain, right? There are a lot more default policies in Azure that you must disable for security purposes. Here is one such example. Users in an Azure environment can invite guests from an external directory or an external tenant, right? This is something you don't want happening. You do not want external users in your environment. This setting right here will leak or will expose your Azure email addresses on LinkedIn, giving attackers another opportunity to launch a password attack or a brute force attack. You do not want that happening as well. So these are a few policies in Azure that are insecure that you need to secure right away. Enable or disable the required policies, right? There are a lot more policies that you must enable or disable. For example, you must control access to the command prompt. This policy will basically allow your admin to set only authorized applications to run in your network and not any other application. This policy will basically disable the ability for your users to inject any USB sticks or USB drives onto the workstations and a lot more, right? One final use case for today before we wrap up with today's webinar is areas of your network that should not be left unmonitored, right? So we saw our local users, we saw our domain users, we saw the policies on our domain, and we saw how all of them, when left in the unconfigured or the default state, can lead to a security incident, right? Similarly, there are a few areas of your network that you must not leave them as is, but you must subject them to regular monitoring, right? For example, when a simple ransomware attack strikes on your network, your firewall rules are changed. Your backup services are destroyed. Services like your event viewer, your Windows event viewer will be shut down, right? New services will be started. Your backup, your files and folders, the data in them or their extensions or their names will be changed, right? A simple ransomware attack modifies various components of your network that you typically don't monitor because you think that they are actually secure and only admins have access to them. So I would encourage you to look at areas in your network, like your firewalls, like your files and folders, like any services that is abruptly stopping or starting to detect the presence of malware on your network, right? Here's one more such example. Do you know the syswall folder on your domain? So the syswall folder is typically used by group policies, right? So the syswall folder basically does the job of propagating any group policy changes from the domain controller to the other servers in your network. What attackers are doing is that they are placing a malicious document or a malicious file in the syswall folder. And once they place it there, the syswall folder, instead of propagating security policies on your domain, will now propagate malware in your domain, right? Just another example of a default that we typically don't monitor that must be monitored. There are a lot other ways problems can happen when you don't monitor areas of your network that must be monitored, right? Whenever a user changes the program's files 86, changes the permissions on it, deletes files from it, or introduces new files in it is something you need to know. Whenever scheduled tasks are randomly created by an external script or an automated script or by a user, this is something that you must detect. Whenever there are changes to the registry key or whenever there are changes to the group policies, triggered by a user or triggered by another script that is running on a network, that is something you must look into. And these are examples of areas in your network, your firewall, your registry, your files and folders, your scheduled tasks that must be monitored for changes at all times. And 8360 can help with that. So in a nutshell, if you have to summarize today's webinar, 8360 will let you gain insight on your entire network. So you get to know what your users are. You get to know what their permissions are on files or folders. You get to know what their permissions are on other user or other security objects on your domain. You get to know details on an attribute level. You get to know permissions in a Microsoft 365 or an Office 365 or an Azure environment if you deployed it as well. You also get to monitor your entire network for security changes, right from user logons to your group policies. Your entire Active Directory network can be monitored. Your Azure network can be monitored if you have Azure. Your data storage devices, like your NetApp servers, your Windows file servers, your Windows file clusters, can be monitored. So whenever there's a file or folder change, a permission change, a data deletion, you will automatically be notified. And not just your file or folders, your endpoints, like your member servers, your workstations, your workgroup machines, all of them can be monitored as well. Here's such an example, a process that could be created or that could be randomly exited, right? A scheduled task that was created on any endpoint on your domain. These could be indications of an attacker or malware spreading on your domain, and I would encourage you to monitor all of this, right? So 8360 to basically help you gain insight on the existing permissions that your users have, help you gain insight on the existing attribute values or properties of your users, and not just your users, your other objects as well in AD, in Office 365, and also to monitor your entire infrastructure for changes, your endpoints, your files and folders, your directory services like Azure and Active Directory, and alert on the sensitive changes, right? So 8360 can help you with that insight, monitoring at all times, and alerting authorized personnel whenever security changes happen. And that is about it for today. Thank you so much for your time.